Hello, my name is Evan Stewart. I'm a lawyer in Manhattan, and I've written a book entitled Myron Taylor, The Man Nobody Knew. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of things, but principally, I want to just highlight a few. First is, but for Mr. Taylor, the man nobody knew, we'd all be speaking German today. World War II would have had a very different outcome. Another thing we'll talk about is Myron Taylor's business career. He was the country's most important businessman of the 20th century. In one role as the CEO of U.S. Steel, he literally saved U.S. Steel before and in the depths of the Depression, and it emerged as the country's and world's largest industrial company after that. And the third thing we'll talk about is this amazing insight that Mr. Taylor had on one of the projects he was working on during World War II, which was, what about the issue of the consolidation of the Arab world, which many people were urging at that point in 1944? Mr. Taylor prophetically said and warned that if we encouraged the consolidation of the Arab world, they would ultimately come up and rise against the Western Anglo-Saxon powers. And we, of course, know that was very prophetic. So these three vignettes we'll talk about and many more on the show today. But this truly is an amazing story about the man that nobody knew. And this book is trying to right that wrong.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. You know, sometimes we choose our legacy, and sometimes it seems like it was thrust upon us. We may be less inclined to carry the banner for the one that we didn't choose, but what if that legacy is exactly what you're supposed to do, even though you might have a whole other career? Imagine finding out about someone most people have never even heard of, yet it's someone who changed the direction and the history of your country and in many ways the world. What if you could bring the man nobody knew to the world? Would you do it? Who is this man nobody knew who changed the world? Well, that's the intriguing road we're going down for the next episode with our guest, Evan Stewart. He's going to be speaking to us about Myron Taylor, the man nobody knew. More about that in a moment. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please get over to wherever it is that you tune into the podcast from and do us a favor. Rate, review, and subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive right in. Our guest for this episode is Evan Stewart. He is the author of a new biography entitled Myron Taylor, The Man Nobody Knew. Evan Stewart is a prominent lawyer from New York City who is a professor at 2 universities and has published over 300 articles. Evan Stewart has written a book that tells the story of one of the most consequential Americans of the 20th century. But until this book's publication, virtually no one alive had even heard of Myron Taylor. Today, we will find out why that is. And we will also learn about the events that not only changed the history of World War II era, but also the impact on the world in which we now live. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Evan Stewart.
Thank you,
welcome,
Jeff.
sir.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Good to have you here. I'm excited to hear about this because, you know, I think that in many ways, there are people who are always grabbing the attention, and particularly today, we live in a world that's focused on that. And then there are always these quiet people in the background who make a massive difference. And I'm really excited to get into this person that nobody's even heard of. But before we do that, let me ask you the question I'd love to start our shows with. which is, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning? Because even when I looked at the book and I looked through what was in there, like that was the question I had about Myron Taylor. It was like, I wonder what the origin story of this guy's life's meaning was, because he followed a very different path. What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
Well, I'd say it's really my parents. My father was the most brilliant man I've ever known. And I've known a lot of brilliant men. He carved a life for himself that was based on principle. And he always tried to do the right thing. I think he always succeeded. My mother was the most compassionate person I've ever known. They were unique, very different strengths. And I think I'd like to think I tried to merge the two of them, but that's really guided my life. Although I'm a big believer in free will, but the influences of those two people I still feel today.
Was your dad-in-law?
He was.
Is that what inspired you to go in that direction?
In large part. I'm actually a fourth generation lawyer in my family.
Is that right? Wow.
Yes, sir. And but it was that, and also virtually, I won't say all, but many of my parents' friends were also Wall Street lawyers, as was my dad. And just observing them on a daily basis growing up, they seemed to have very interesting lives, doing different things every day, challenging things, helping clients, and that just seemed like a very worthy path to follow.
It's interesting because when you talk about lawyers and Wall Street lawyers, that doesn't conjure up great images of morality. For the rest of us, who sort of have gone, ooh, yeah, we know what everybody, Enron got away. The banks all got away, the CEOs. So it's really interesting that you look at it from this moral position of your dad always trying to do the right thing and then following in that path, when we on the outside have of course that's somewhat biased, but we have maybe a different view of that. So it's interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I would say that many of the most satisfying things I've done over 45 years of practice have been for individuals, helping them stay out of jail and things of that sort. But as a lawyer, you're trained to, and I've carried this out my entire life, and this is what I teach, to zealously represent every client to the best of your ability and not make moral judgments about whether they're people, bad people, companies that make bad things or impact people badly. And I found in some of the world's most complex commercial enterprises, wonderful people who are striving to do very, very good things for not just the companies they work for, but their clients and the public. So this sort of caricature that people have about Wall Street or big business, some of that's justified, but the broad brush paint effect really is not worth of following, in my judgment.
Of course. And this book, The Man That Nobody Knew, as I said, is about Myron Taylor, who, we don't know. Like, as you said, it's, the man who nobody knew. Why don't we know about him? Why in modern science, why don't we know about him? And why do we need to? Because I'm imagining, after our previous conversation, that law mind of you that digs into finding stuff that's underneath the thing. Why do we need to know about this guy? And why don't we? That's also important.
Yeah. So two questions. Why don't we and why should we?
Yeah.
So why don't we? Well, one reason is he didn't write any memoirs, but more importantly, and this comes through from the archival research I did, Taylor was very much a 19th century Victorian gentleman who just didn't think it was appropriate to promote himself. In fact, in his second business career, after he was first the czar of the textile industry and made an absolute fortune in that, he retired and thought he would spend the rest of his life having a good time. But then he takes over at the begging of his friend J.P. Morgan. He takes over U.S. Steel and saves U.S. Steel. And when he takes over U.S. Steel, he's on the front page of every national magazine. And on one of them, it says the man nobody knows, because he refused to give interviews. So
he refused.
Yes, he didn't. He just thought that was not appropriate. And so this 19th century Victorian gentleman's code of ethics and code of conduct carried with him even when he became world famous. I mean, when he becomes a diplomat on behalf of Roosevelt and then Truman, he is world famous at this time. But his not charging to the fore and having press conferences every day continues. And this is what makes him very, very important to Roosevelt and then later to Truman, because they knew they could rely upon Taylor not to have some sort of separate agenda to promote himself to some other job. You contrast that with Joe Kennedy, who was the ambassador to the Great Britain, who was a constant headache to Roosevelt because he was always trying to advance his own career to the detriment of the administration. Taylor was the 180-degree opposite, and that's what made him so valuable, again, first to Roosevelt and then to Truman.
So I know that that he graduated from Cornell as a lawyer, but as you said, he started off in the textile industry, as you said, became the czar of the textile industry, retired, and then became the CEO of U.S. Steel, and saved it during the the great downfall of American society. I mean, nothing was surviving. What do you in your research, what did you find out about what did he do differently? I mean, because obviously J.P. Morgan brought him in because he saw his wisdom,
right?
And J.P. Morgan was not a dumb guy. So what was it about him that was like a guy from textiles, a guy with law? Why did you bring him in as CEO of a steel organization, particularly in the day when you and I know, if we read our history, people are only brought in who are familiar with the industry. We don't bring somebody from outside of the industry in. I mean, it's different today, but that back in those days.
Yeah, they did. Morgan did consider whether not having a background in steel would be a problem. But he and the other fellow who brought him in, it's the head of the largest bank here in New York, a fellow named George Baker, both said that, well, there's really not a conceptual difference between a textile mill and a steel mill per se. And so they got over that hump pretty quickly. I think the real reason they brought him in was because by this point he was so well known among the big business cognoscenti for his what we would call today corporate finance skills. That was the initial problem that J.P. Morgan identified that had to be addressed, which was the U.S. Steel had $430 million of debt.
Wow! Back in those days,
1927 was a lot of money. When you think about it, there was about $31 million every year that had to be paid. And first thing Taylor did was come in and study the company and identified, yes, that was before he did anything else, he had to retire virtually that entire debt, which he did right before October 1929.
Wow.
Yeah. So J.P. Morgan says the most amazing thing he'd ever seen in business, that somehow he restructured the debt of the company into equity right before the
Great Depression,
before the market crash of October 29. So, but for that, there would have been no U.S. Steel. Then, in the 3 years later, in 1932, the real nadir of the Depression, when the company's working at 17% capacity. Can you imagine 17% capacity?
How do you even survive at 17% of capacity?
Correct. And he refuses to fire anyone. Can you imagine anyone doing that today? And
refused to fire anyone at 70% of capacity. So I want to sort of put that into context of today because, we had a pandemic and companies were working at, some of them were working at 50% of capacity, and it was devastating. 17 and refusing to fire. That brings up a lot because I read in there that, he was the first major person to do labor agreements.
Yes.
Right. When, like back in the day, it was like, oh, you want a union? Bugger off you go. You're getting nothing, right? Let alone work. You're not getting any better pay. And he also took on that. So is this moral ground as well? This, I don't know. It's kind of like this care for the working man. I'm perceiving. Obviously, I'm perceiving.
Well, it's a mixture. So he thought it was the right thing to do, not just for the workers, but it's the right thing to do for U.S. Steel. And he was, as virtually everything he did in his career, he was absolutely right. And the timing was perfect because this was a time when Europe was gearing up for World War II. People didn't know at the time and needed vast quantities of steel.
Yes.
Meanwhile, all of U.S. Steel's competitors were having terrible labor riots because they refused to unionize, and literally blood was flowing in all these other steel plants. And so he bought labor peace at precisely the right moment to bring U.S. Steel out of the Depression, make it, again, the world's most important and largest industrial company, a true juggernaut.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't just altruism, it was just good business sense. And as another person said, what he ultimately really gave labor in the terms of this agreement that he reached with John L. Lewis, who was a pretty tough customer, was really what they were entitled to as a matter of law under the Wagner Act of 1935. So it was smart. The timing was good. As everything, Taylor's timing as a business person was uncanny, as witnessed by the.
That's what stands out for me is that he somehow seemed to have this crystal ball of wisdom for the thing that was coming and to step ahead of that and to step into that because. Like I said, I don't get it that I don't get that he was altruistic, but I get that he was in service, and he was in service at a higher mind level. He was thinking beyond the obvious because these things might have been very timely, but other people weren't seeing them. Like you said, there's labor riots, there's other steel companies saying, we're giving you nothing, we're struggling here. And he decides, no, we're going to give you these things. And it becomes the catalyst and the catapult in many ways for, as you said, U.S. Steel becoming the juggernaut that it was for the military, for the military industrial machine, really.
Yeah. Well, this is another thing that's implicit in everything we've talked about so far, Dov, which is the thing that really makes Taylor, I won't say unique for the time, but certainly unique for our time today. Mm-hmm. He always believed that he wasn't, his perception of things wasn't always right. Mm. He always thought it was important to hear what the other fellow was thinking and saying, because he thought he could learn something. Maybe the other guy had a good reason for his position. If he would listen and consider it carefully, maybe he could come to an accommodation with that other position, which is what happened with labor and John L. Lewis. This humility and ability to empathize and just listen was the key to his business success, just beyond his sheer brain power. His ability to bring people together who otherwise wouldn't have wanted to talk to one another. No, just because he, you said at the beginning, unlike people today who think I can convince you by shouting at you, which never works. I'm not trying to sell you something. Let's talk about this. Right. I'd love to hear what you have to say, why you believe what you are saying, and justifying your position, and maybe we can accommodate that. And frankly, I think people appreciate that approach.
Absolutely.
They think it's open-minded and really attempting to be constructive. And of course, is all those things. And
absolutely. And I know in the book you talk a lot about, him being made ambassador to the Vatican and also his dealings with Russia. But there's also another piece that was quite surprising in my research was how he approached the Arab world, in that he said, we in the West, we have no idea. We don't understand these people. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I find that particularly intriguing in the context of what you were just saying, and his willingness to listen.
Yeah, so this all came up, what you're referencing came up when he was in Washington during World War II, couldn't get back to the Vatican.
Right.
And he was doing a number of things for Roosevelt, post-war planning. He was one of the godfathers of the United Nations. He was the godfather of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which still governs our economic world today. And one of the other things he was doing was trying to deal with the displacement of approximately 20 million people who had lost their homes. I mean, 40 million people died in World War II, but 20 million people didn't have a place to live after World War II. And so one of the focuses of this particular group he was on was the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, there was a lot of effort to consolidate the Middle East. They thought that many people thought that would be a good thing. And he writes a memo to Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State in March of 1944, and says, I don't think this is such a good idea. As you say, he writes, we don't really know anything about the Arabs, other than they're a bunch of tribes loosely connected by blood and fanaticism. And what I'm worried about is if they do get consolidated, they'll rise up against the Western world. And I'm reading.
How prophetic, huh? I mean, what year was this?
1944.
1944. When we have to think of, I want you, as you're listening to this, when you stop for a moment and think about the Arab world in 1944. In fact, go on Google and research, take a picture, do image search on the Arab world, any place you want in the Arab world, pick a name, and then to ask for a photograph of it in, 1950, let alone in World War II. And you'll see there's nothing. There's really nothing. I mean, of course, we can look at Saudi now and places like that and go, wow. But these were nomadic tribes. And this man had the vision to see a lot of the problems we've suffered from in the 21st century. He saw those 50 years in advance. That's a phenomenal piece of information.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting. I was reading this memo in the Library of Congress, and I'm thinking, well, where's the reply? Because he and Cordell Hull were very good friends, and it wasn't there. And it turned out that it was back in the Taylor papers at Cornell, the reply without the original memo. And unfortunately, the reply by Hull a couple of weeks later was, "Don't worry about it. The Brits, who are experts on the Middle East, say this is a good thing and we shouldn't worry about it." And of course,
yes,
the British made a total mess of the
really, the British? Oh, how hard to believe. As a Brit, I will say, how hard to believe.
Well, they're the ones who drew all the lines of the nation states in the Middle East.
Of course, they made a mess.
Yeah. And so in any event, he continued on in this. Actually, in the post-war, he was advising Truman on what to do about a Jewish state, and he writes a memo. He was sort of on the side of the debate of this with George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, former head of the Army, who thought this would be a very bad idea
to create a state of Israel.
Yes, at least the way it was being talked about at that time.
Sure.
So he writes a memo to Truman that says, given the sensitivities of the Arab world, to make one home for Israel right smack dab in the middle of Palestine is just never going to bring peace. If we could make one place in the world, 1 out of 5, as a place for Jewish people to call a home. That will be less of a stick in the eye than having one right in the middle forced on them. And that didn't go so well. I don't know whether you know the context of this. This all ties into the consequences, terrible meeting that Roosevelt had with King Saud on the way back from Yalta, where Roosevelt, who knew, again, virtually little about the Middle East, thought he could sweet talk King Saud into letting the Jews have a nation state in Palestine. And King Saud said, no, we're going to kill them if they come here.
Yes.
And there'll never be peace. And Roosevelt tried all sorts of different ways to talk around this, but Saud was absolutely emphatic. And the last thing Roosevelt said to him was, well, I will surely consult you before we do anything on this. Unfortunately, no one told Harry Truman about that promise to King Saud before it all. So there's a lot of mess around this particular issue, but you're right. Myron Taylor, his instincts on this were spot on, and unfortunately, he was not. This was one issue where he was not listened to, and it was not one of his principal focuses, but he was asked to get involved in it, and he did.
Yeah, but there again is, even though it wasn't his focus, he had the insight. And so, as you talk a lot about in the book, and it's the cover of the book, there's a picture of him with the Swiss Guard at Vatican City. He's appointed as ambassador to the Vatican, which caused a lot of hoo-ha anyway, because it was seen as a mix of church and state. Kind of like to see that separation again, personally, today. A lot of people screaming who are on the far right who are saying we need a Christian government. I think the founding fathers actually said we need a one where everybody can have their faith, but maybe that's my imagination.
You're right.
Yeah, I was being facetious, but he went in there. Why was he put in, particularly seeing as this was World War II? This is also known as the Nazi Pope, which is a delicate balance. You've got the stuff going on in Germany. I know, as you talked about, that he helped a lot with the displacement of people out of Nazi Germany. He was trying to make some roads there, but he was also placed with the Vatican with this, quote, Nazi Pope. Talk to us about that position and why that was so controversial at that time.
Well, it was very controversial, not because the nation's church-state issue. It was controversial really because the country was still or large portions of the country were still very much prejudiced against Catholics. The country had just gone through the 1928 election with Al Smith as a Democratic nominee, which was a really just viciously ugly anti-Catholic backlash. It was really, really ugly. And the country was still reverberating from that. So there was a lot of Protestant opposition to Taylor's appointment, especially among the Southern Baptists. They were vehemently opposed to this. So that was more where the opposition came from. Why does Roosevelt do this? Roosevelt was one of the great things about doing this archival research. I'd known a lot about Roosevelt before I started the book, but doing this archival research, you can actually see what some of his biographers have talked about, how he never did anything for one purpose. He always did things for 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 reasons, which is like the Taylor appointment. Right. He was a very manipulative, very devious in the best sense of that word person. So he makes this. Let me just give you a couple reasons why he did this. The list is very long, but one reason he did this was for domestic political reasons. He had been having discussions with the Catholic Church in America for a number of years, especially with his most powerful Catholic figure in the country, a fellow named Cardinal Mundelein, who was based in Chicago, very powerful figure in the church,
Yes.
and also a very powerful political figure in the Middle West.
Yes.
And so Roosevelt, as he's planning, not thinking, but planning on running for a third term, an unprecedented third term as president, he wants to have a very strong Catholic support in his favor. Having a personal representative to the Vatican with ambassador rank is certainly a very big feather in the cap of the church. And Roosevelt knows this. Another reason that Roosevelt does this is to shut up a guy named Father Coughlin, who's the so-called radio priest, who's been making life a living hell for Roosevelt every week on the radio, denouncing his administration in almost scatological terms. It's sort of hard to believe a priest would be doing that. But this guy had quite a following, and Roosevelt was hopeful by doing this, the church would sit on Coughlin and shut him up.
Right.
So there are a whole host of domestic political reasons. Other reasons is Roosevelt was hoping to influence church appointments in the United States, believe it or not.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Because he wanted, well, among other reasons, the church church officials were not short on or shy about expressing political views. And the church was one of the
What's
leading.
different?
Church,
Just a different church today.
The church had a lot of very conservative, outspoken isolationists giving those sorts of sermons that the country should not get involved in European affairs,
right.
should stick close to the border here, had no business in what Britain was doing, with no business in what France was doing, etc. This was not helpful stuff for a president that was trying to mold public opinion to, if nothing,
and joining the Second World War,
or at least
in Europe,
the so-called arsenal of democracy to supply arms to Great Britain and to others he could fight. This was very, very. Roosevelt once gave a speech in 1937 when he was visiting Cardinal Mundelein in Chicago, where he tried to change the public debate on this, and there was a resounding. It fell flat on the floor. He said later to one of his aides, he said, "It's terrible to try to lead when no one's behind you." So to try to change the church's view about trying to be more helpful to Europe, be more open to Europe, all those things, that's another thing that's very much on Roosevelt's mind. Another thing that's on his mind is, as the 1930s is progressing closer and closer to Germany invading Poland, virtually all the Western democracies their embassies are closing down. So, Kristallnacht, for example, in Germany, we pulled our ambassador out of Germany in 1937. Right. So
after Kristallnacht.
Yes, after all these embassies are closing, we don't have really sources of information.
Right.
The UN at this point, the Vatican at this point is essentially like the UN. Everybody has an ambassador to the UN, so it's a source of great information of what's going on. People tell the Pope all sorts of things. What does the Pope do with that information? Well, sometimes he passes it back, and oftentimes he passes it because of the relationship he has with Taylor. Oftentimes he passes it directly back to Taylor. So when the German,
so it was diplomatic intelligence,
as
much as anything else.
Yes.
Right? It was diplomatic intelligence to find out what was actually going on in Europe or in other parts of the world.
Yes.
And another that needed somebody that important.
Yes, and another reason, again, the timing of the Taylor appointment is Mussolini has not yet joined the war, and he's hoping that Taylor over there can sort of help the Pope to push Mussolini away from the precipice. It's also important that Taylor actually was a friend of Mussolini's. Believe it or not, they used to go grouse hunting.
What?
Yes.
Wow.
In the early 1930s. Well, you have to remember, in the early 30s, Winston Churchill was calling Mussolini a great man, and most people thought that Mussolini had done a very good job. And you remember, Italy was at that point still a very young country.
Yes.
And he had pulled the country together, had modernized the country, was viewed as a very effective leader of the country. Mm-hmm. So Roosevelt knows about this prior relationship that Taylor has with Mussolini. Maybe that could be a factor as well. But
yes,
it's also another reason is the Pope's moral authority, not just with 400 million Catholics, but throughout the world, having the Pope more favorably disposed to our point of view,
yes,
rather than to the point of view of the totalitarian governments, is obviously a geopolitical advantage to us if we can pull that off, which Taylor does. So I've given you some flavor for all the reasons. There's some other reasons as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, enough for about 4 hours of conversation, including the stuff with Russia. When I look at all that, the question that comes to mind it's a couple of questions, but one of the questions that comes to mind for me, because I want people to have context and I want them to read your book because I want them to have context, is you did so much research on this and it was a treasure hunt. I mean, you and I talked about this before. It was not an easy process. You were running around all over the shop trying to get this. It wasn't your project. It was a project that you took on. How, from your point of view, from all the research you did, how do you believe the world would have been different without Myron Taylor and the work that he did and the impact that he had? What road might we have gone down without him?
Well, I can give you a number of examples. Let me give you one that I'd like to talk about as the principal one.
Mm-hmm.
I like to tell people we'd all be speaking German, but for Myron Taylor. So when
you think the Nazis would have won the war?
Yes. So, and it's not just me that believes that. Stalin believed that.
Really?
Yes.
Without Myron Taylor?
Yes. So
the Nazis would have won.
Yeah.
So here's a guy. I want everybody to grasp this. Just pause for a minute because this is important. Here's a guy you've never heard of, who without him, the Nazis would have won the war, not according just to Americans, but also according to Stalin, who was a ferocious force in Russia. Like, it's mind-blowing that this guy nobody's heard of changed the course of the Second World War in such a dramatic way.
It's pretty amazing. So I'll try to give you a quick synopsis of this story.
Mm-hmm.
Lend-Lease, when it went through Congress by just a sliver, because of the isolationist opposition,
yep,
was meant solely to be for Great Britain. But then, of course, we know that Hitler invades Russia, and just it's like a knife through a butter. He takes Ukraine. He goes thousands of miles into Russia, and Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, says, Roosevelt, our best estimates is that the Soviet Union will be conquered in 3 months, if not sooner.
Wow.
Right. So Roosevelt has to get military assistance to the Russians. Otherwise, they're going to go down the tubes. The problem is, I talked about a little this before, the isolationist base in the church. There was not just the isolation of the church generally, and particularly in the Middle West. The church had issued an encyclical in 1937. The Vatican had issued an encyclical that said anyone who does anything to be of help in any way to the atheistic leaders or the atheistic state of the Soviet Union will burn in hell for all time. Oh. There's no ambiguity here. It was that clear.
No.
So here you have not just the isolationistic sentiment, but it's church doctrine.
Yes.
front and center that you can't do this. And this is not just some sort of hypothetical. I talked about before about sermons. There have been people who've been giving sermons, people contemporaneously giving sermons from the pulpits in the church, saying American boys would be justified in not serving in the military if we support the Soviet Union. Wow. That's a verbatim quote. So Roosevelt's got to find a way around this. He sends Taylor to the Vatican to see if they'll play ball. And it's a very long and complicated back channel. It's James Bond sort of spy sort of stuff, incredible stuff. What's going on in the church in this country, what's going on in the church. In any event, long and the short is he ultimately convinces the Pope and his advisors to play ball on the theory that this aid is not supporting the Soviet Union, the government. This is supporting the people of Russia, who the Pope, of course, has great affection. The Pope agrees to that, but he says two things. First, I can't have my fingerprints anywhere on this because of the encyclical, the 1937 encyclical. And I can't issue this. What we're going to do this, we're going to do this through a back channel in America. We're going to pick one of the most isolationistic bishops, and they pick this fella in Cincinnati, and they deliver the news to him that he's going to have to give a public address and make this national news that the church supports the idea of bringing aid and comfort to the Russian people who the church and the Pope love and want to see do well. This guy does this. The same day he does this, after it's broadcast nationally, Roosevelt sends a wire to Stalin saying, I'm going to commit the first $1 billion of aid that same day. He delays the public announcement of expanding Lend-Lease to Russia by a week, so that all the news of the church's views can be taken into account. So there's no opposition in the Senate, in the Congress. And so one of Roosevelt's biographers writes about this episode. This was known at the time. This episode did justify this title that Taylor had, which was Ambassador Extraordinary. He really deserved the title, because otherwise, as Stalin said, Stalin toasted at the Tehran conference, but for this aid getting through, we would not have survived and been able to counter the Nazis. So ultimately, $11 billion in 1941 dollars. Can you imagine how much money that is today?
I can't even imagine. Right. That is vast. When we look at what's going on with the Ukraine and the money being sent, and you think about what America did at that time for Russia, particularly, a communist, Stalin-esque Russia, that's pretty amazing.
But Roosevelt knew at this point, Roosevelt knew we were going to be in the war, not if, but when. Mm-hmm. If the Soviets had been taken out, because remember, England was only hanging on by a fingernail at that point.
Yes.
Well, we'd done nothing. We weren't in the war. If Hitler had been able to pull all his troops back from the Eastern Front, we never would have gotten into Northwest Europe. Not a prayer. And so he probably would have gone against Great Britain again, because again we'd consolidate all his forces. So where would we be but for that aid getting through to Russia?
That is amazing.
Never would have gotten through but for Myron Taylor.
What a fascinating story. Now, I know we're coming towards the end of the show, and I want to just ask you, because to me it's a fascinating question. We started off by saying this was a humble man. He didn't do interviews. He didn't do those things. But why has no one written a biography about him since then? I mean, this is a man of extraordinary influence and impact on the world, as you said, not just on America. why did nobody pick that banner up? Why? I mean, the guy who handed it to you certainly did, your professor, but why did nobody before that? Why was there not a book written about him in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, to say, here's the guy you don't know about? Do you have any idea why nobody wrote that?
The only answer I can come up with is it's a lot of work to do it.
Yeah, evidently, as you well know.
His papers are in 5 different places: at Cornell, at the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, the Truman Library in Missouri, the Library of Congress in Washington, and the Library of Congress Annex in Maryland. And that's just his papers. Another reason, I think, frankly, is because the whole issue you talked about, the Hitler's Pope, that whole issue is so polarizing. I mean, we have this unending heated debate between 2 extremes. He's Hitler's Pope, or he should be canonized. And as you know from my book, because I've done the work, the answer is somewhere in the messy middle of history. It's neither of those 2 extremes. It's a very complicated subject. It doesn't lend itself to one-liners. It depends what year in the war you're talking about, and frankly, what country in Europe you're talking about the church's role. It's very complicated. But to do that work takes a lot of time. And candidly, the Vatican over time has been releasing archival materials, not all at once. So 30 years ago, this book would not be the same book because of all the stuff that's been revealed since then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it was his personal reluctance. The archival material is very difficult to pull all that together. And just the sheer amount of stuff that's been people's diaries, scholarly works, all the stuff that's really come out relatively recently. So as I say in the preface, 20 years ago when my professor handed this off to me, if I'd finished it then, which would have been impossible, but if I had finished it, it would not be anywhere near as complete a book, just because of the sheer volume of stuff that's come out in the time since then. So it's a complicated subject, but he's also not since he's not a president, right? How many books have been written about Franklin Roosevelt, right? Over and over and over again, and Abraham Lincoln, over and over and over again. Appointed officials, sometimes they get sort of lost in the shuffle,
I guess. Yeah.
And if you're so modest, why should you write about someone who's modest? That it's not quite as flashy as somebody who's
Evan Stewart, I thank you for writing about him, and thank you for bringing him to the world and sort of bringing his character and his skill set and his moral code to the world in a way that is profound. It really is. I want to thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for all that you've shared. I want to make sure that people know more about you, know more about the book, where they can get it, all those things. Would you please tell our audience where they can find out more about you, about the book, and about all of the different resources that are available?
So the easiest thing to do is just Google my name, Evan Stewart, and Google Myron Taylor, and everything will pop up on your screen. That will be where you can buy it on Amazon if you're so inclined. You can see a link to a speech that I gave at Cornell at the end of April, giving more detail about the Taylor book. You can go on my website at my law firm, estewart@cohenandgresser.com, to learn more about me. But again, the easiest thing is just type in Evan Stewart, Myron Taylor, and you'll see about 20 different entries that will give you.
And you'll see it's the only thing that comes up.
Yes,
exactly. As you said, because nobody's done it. So that's why it's the only thing that comes up. Evan, I really want to thank you for being with us. It's been a pleasure and honor. Thank you for all of your hard work. I know that this was a a massive undertaking. We sincerely appreciate it. And I hope you'll stay with us to the end. For you, dear listener, of course, we'll make sure that all the links are posted in the show notes. And for those of you who understand that those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of that tribe, whether it's business or political leaders committed to positively shaping the landscape, you know that we've got to tap into human behavior. And you can tap into that groundbreaking understanding by understanding the anatomy of meaning extracted from the emotional source code of your organization, of your individuals. I'm Dov Baron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe, because unified actualized meaning is the single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for individuals and for companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the figures who shift history who you've never heard of. The men and women that nobody knows that have actually changed the direction of our lives. Remember, as Evan talked about, if it wasn't for this man, Myron Taylor, we'd all be speaking German. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you, tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.